All right, we're here with Rod Squires. And Rod, tell us a little bit about what you do in the Department of Geography.
Well, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Society and Environment. No, Geography, Environment and Society. We changed our name 2 years ago from geography to be more encompassing, to fit in with the modern paradigms, idioms of education, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm an associate professor there. I've been there 40 years. Long time. I've grown old here.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, maybe a brief overview of your research interests and experiences as it relates to environmental communication. I know that you've been at the center of a lot of different environmental issues, debates, procedures. So a little bit about your research interests and experiences.
Well, you know, when I first came here, I was a paleoecologist, which means I was interested in vegetational history and climate change and human interference on vegetation. And then I decided I didn't want to look down a microscope anymore. So I educated myself in the way in which the government of the United States works, so basically public policy and law. And that's really what I've been teaching the last 15, 20 years, is public policy, legal issues, from a social scientist perspective. But I'm particularly interested in land ownership issues and the history of land ownership, particularly in the Midwest. So, you know, that's where most of my research efforts go. Is on trying to understand early settlement, if you like, a lot of the land ownership. Talk about land ownership. So I teach courses on public policy, both the federal level and the state level. And what I'm interested in doing there is getting students to look at the original documents, to look at the statutes, look at the legislation, rather than look at articles where authors talk about legislation. Yeah. And so they get the original materials, and I force them to read it and analyze it and things like that. Same with the regulations and court cases. I kind of force them to read that. And then I teach a course on real estate, which really is looking at the history and current practices regarding land ownership. And I focus on the metropolitan area and take students out to various county officials and people that work in the real estate business. I don't teach a course on how to buy and sell real estate, but I teach on what land ownership has meant in American history and American geography.
Oh, wonderful. Well, you seem to be fairly uniquely situated then to think about how question of public participation, communicating with publics, and then communicating with policymakers. Are there any suggestions or thoughts you've had having done that in your lifetime about how to communicate to those different audiences?
Well, the difficulty is, of course, at any research, there's lots of details about the research, and there's a framework that in a sense poses the questions that we gather the details to answer. And I found that by and large, many people don't want to know the details. They want to know the framework. They're comfortable with that. They want a sound bite, if you like. So they give them the framework. As soon as you delve into the details, their eyes glaze over and they fall asleep. So a lot of my work actually is with land surveyors and city engineers and people like that are interested in the way in which the land was divided up and the history of that. I'm not a surveyor, so but the work I do tries to inform surveyors about the material they use and how they go about doing their work, because whether they like it or not, the modern surveyor is what we call following in the footsteps of the earliest surveyors. And really, state law says that the modern day surveyors have to follow the monuments that were set, or the stakes in the ground that were set by those early people in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. So, you know, a lot of my communication is either to a general audience like students, or to an audience that doesn't know much about surveying, and then to surveyors who really want the details. And I'm not comfortable about all the details because I don't know some of the details of surveying. I mean, that's really quite a scientific, mathematical sort of do. So, you know, you have to wear several hats. And what I like putting myself in uncomfortable positions. So I was involved in a couple of court cases that we mentioned before we came on air, and there, that's another interesting experience, because in front of a class or even in front of lecture, when you're doing a lecture in front of professionals, you can expound on various things. You can let your mouth run away with you sometimes. when you're in a legal situation, that's a no-no. And so it's really a very, very particular sort of experience. Now, I haven't testified too much in too many public hearings, but the same would be the same thing. In other words, limit yourself to particular issues that you think are important. But I'm curious now how those issues are important cascade into other issues that are somewhat less important. I'm not any answers, any questions that can be answered with a soundbite, intrinsically aren't worth asking, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with modern communication as a whole. Everybody wants a soundbite. Dan Gunderson called me up, who's a correspondent for NPR. He called me up the day before I think it was the White Earth Band were going to go wild ricing out of season, and they'd been threatened that they were going to be all sued. And he obviously was looking for a soundbite about it, because he knew I'd done some work on with the Mill Lac bands and then some Michigan bands. And I'd just written an article actually on that Mill Lac case for a rural Minnesota journal. So he got my name somehow. And I knew he was looking for a soundbite, and I just really didn't give him one.
Yeah. He
for
was
a whole
hoping to
variety
get a
of
simple
reasons.
he said, she said sort of contest.
Yeah,
And it was more nuanced
yeah, I
and
think so. And
complex.
and he'd already been talking to the attorney for the bands and things like this. So he had some sound bites, but he was looking for a different one, and I wasn't about it. I didn't give him one. I was quite proud of myself, because normally I would expound at length if somebody said, "Tell me about what you think." Oh.
And then he'd turn it into a soundbite.
Yeah, then he would turn it into sound. So I didn't give him anything. So that was. But so there are lots of audiences, and of course you have to tailor your remarks to audiences. One of the real problem areas, of course, is when you don't know your audience. When you get asked to give a talk, say after dinner. In fact, I have to give a talk. I belong to a dining faculty club, and I have to give a talk in December. That's at the Christmas meeting. They're all going to be. So it's going to be interesting to figure out what I talk about, what I tell them, or what I don't tell them. So it's going to be an interesting pitch. But I do it deliberately, because I'm out of my comfort zone there. I'm not an after-dinner speaker.
Right.
I need PowerPoints. I need to know what I'm talking about. And after dinner,
not
when
the
you're relaxing,
Toastmasters
is
sort of,
so that'll be interesting to see how I communicate. And they're all bright people. They're all faculty members or emeritus members of the faculty. So they're going to want to know detail and framework. So I'm going to have to work hard on that. So, but again, communication, as you know, as you go through the university, introductory courses require different levels of communication than senior courses and things like that. I wish it wasn't the case, because the answers to questions don't vary depending on the level you're at in a university.
More in terms of what you can say.
That's right. What we know about a particular issue.
You nicely tied together three things, I think: public participation, law, and also news, in the sense that one thing they share in common is there is that sort of preset framework that you have to know in some cases what is and is not possible, and what are the magic words. Yeah. For example, the students are doing this thing called a public participation game, where if you don't know the right legal term or the right policy-oriented term for a scoping hearing, no matter how brilliant your argument, you're not going to advance. On the other hand, as you point out, the issues themselves are much more complicated.
Yeah.
And I'd like to use that as a segue to talk about something that I know you know quite a little bit about, the Boundary Waters canoe area. It's a situation that I think most of us go there and think, well, this has always been here. Naturally, it's just like this now. But if you know much about it, you realize there's this whole history, legislative history, and I imagine communication played a large role in that. Can you tell us anything about that particular case, as far as how that developed and maybe what role communication played? Well,
you're right. I mean, we forget that the national forests, national parks, wilderness areas weren't always there. Some have been there longer than others. Yellowstone, 1873. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area was created. It's a land management unit in many respects within the National Forest, Superior National Forest, in 1964. If one looks before 1964, there was a lot of commercial exploitation going on. In fact, in the early part of the 20th century, there were plans, or 1910, 1920, there were plans to dam up all those boundary waters to create water power for what was presumed to be a thriving paper industry. That was blocked in the end by, I think, a combination of state and federal actions. But it's interesting, if you read the Wilderness Act of 1964, of course nobody usually reads the original act, they read what people say about the original act. You'll realize that that piece of legislation, like most pieces of legislation, was a compromise, and the language in the actual act reflects the compromise, because the Boundary Waters Canoe Area was specifically excluded from full wilderness protection. I mean, in one of the clauses, and I've forgotten the actual number, people can have a look at the 1964 Act, they talk about mining, motorized transportation, and logging will not be excluded. from the wilderness. Now, how you go from the definition of wilderness as an area untrammeled by humans to logging, motorized transportation and mining baffles the imagination. But in a sense, it's what had to be done to get the approval of the Minnesota legislative bodies at that point, or legislative people at that point in time. So it was a compromise. So between 1964 and 1978, when there was a particular piece of legislation that focused particularly on the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, which specifically excluded commercial logging from much of the interior part, excluded mining from the area, and curtailed a lot of motorized transportation. There was a lot of controversy, and a lot of court cases were involved. And many of the Friends of the Wilderness, was it Friends of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, I think, the whole number of wilderness advocates that were fighting those battles, saying how stupid it is to have wilderness where you can have logging. And some of those cases went to the Supreme Court, most went to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. And there's still some issues about people. For example, I believe there are a number of private mineral interests in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. In fact, the state also has not only mineral interests, it has surface interests within the wilderness area. And at the moment, the Forest Service and the Department of Natural Resources are trying to do a swap so that the state will acquire the land the feds will acquire the land in the state lands in the wilderness area, and the state will acquire lands outside the wilderness area in the National Forest area in lieu of those lands. And that's been an ongoing battle for 10, 15, 20 years to get that. And so, all management units, whether it be a small management unit like, say, the Point 2 National Wildlife Refuge in Mille Lacs, or the 1.2 million acre BWC, they're all they have a history of controversy and literally compromise. And one of the things that I try and point out when I teach and do research on this is that these are not historical accidents. They're not historical accidents. And if we're not careful, we'll lose them. For example, it's my firm belief that if we have copper nickel mining or the proposed mining, it will destroy. How badly, I don't know, but it will destroy the wilderness. It will destroy the wilderness properties. And so, but again, it comes to a compromise between wilderness and jobs, and that I don't go there. Yeah. Although I talk about policy, I'm not paid well enough to come up with the answers. and the vilification that comes with that, or the praise that comes with that. Right, so right. I just try and paint the dimensions of the problem and say, there's the problem, it has to be solved. These are the stakeholders. Here's what they're saying. You have to decide yourself. I don't live in Ely. Yeah. So in a sense, I have no horse in the race, except I'm a member of the community. So I want to see the Boundary Waters Canoe Area there. I don't personally go up there, but I have friends that are, and they like it, love it, and it's certainly a star in our outdoor recreational arena, so to speak.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you showing up today to talk about these issues. Really went across the board, and even in the end there got as far as conflict resolution, which is a whole other ball of wax, I think, as you present as scholars. Maybe we sometimes don't want to get involved in that. So
well, we can't. Our role is it seems to me, we can give an opinion, of course we all do in classes, but we have to try and frame any issue in the broadest possible way. So students that from the right or the left or central, or students that don't know anything or students that know everything, can make up their minds whether the evidence you present or the evidence you leave out. We're not dispassionate members after all, but on the other hand, we do have an obligation, I think, to present the stuff that's out there and accessible.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, thank you so much.
Okay.